Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. Very nice to see all of your faces in person. My name is Dean Saranilio. I'm faculty in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, and this year I'm honored to be serving as the interim director of the Asian Pacific American Institute. This year is the Institute's 25th anniversary, and in the fall we had an event recognizing those students and faculty who played significant roles in getting what became both the Institute and the Asian Pacific American Studies program. For these reasons and more, we have chosen to organize events that both allow for reflection about our current moment and collective dreaming of alternatives to the racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, and colonial imaginings that predetermined them. And in the fall, we were very fortunate to have Jess X, who allowed us to dream about a beautiful future during what are often heavy and unsettling times. Jess generously shared their time and work with us, serving as our student artists in residence. We are fortunate to have them sitting on this afternoon's panel. And this spring semester, we were again fortunate to have another artist whose work speaks directly to this moment, Khaty Xiong. Khaty has helped us to sit with grief, to allow discomfort to serve as a space for growth and love, staying with the trouble as a means to renew our understandings of how precious our time and connections are with each other. Khaty Xiong writes beautifully in her Artist in Residence statement, quote, "In grief, we seldom arrive with the language to help us translate the pain of our losses, even when the sorrow is shared by others. The act of grieving can be quite solitary, particularly in diasporic communities where war and displacement have shaped many generations. Concepts of healing may be hard to define. How then do we meet our grief and face it with confidence? In what ways can we nurture ourselves and each other?" She goes on to say about the immersive poetry installation Grief Garden that it is, quote, "constructed to promote this attention on grief, where profound loss may take the shape it needs to drive forward the necessity of these conversations and to challenge our haunting lineages that may otherwise keep us in limbo." Khaty's Grief Garden, which will be open to us after this panel, and her meditations on different communities' concepts of healing, reminds me of the Kanaka Uiwi word ea, meaning breath, life, sovereignty, and autonomy. In fact, one of the leaves Khaty uses for writings in the garden is that of the taro plant, which in Hawaii's origin stories is the elder sibling of the Hawaiian people and one of the original canoe plants that came on long journeys traversing the Pacific. Indeed, the rooted are always routed and vice versa. And I believe the word ea is of prescient relevance to the strange world we are navigating today. Specifically, the way that staying in the present when the current political climate feels unbearable can be both pedagogical and a form of practice. The word ea helps to conceptualize another epistemology that ties material and collective autonomy together at one of the basic necessities of life, that is breath. Engaging one's breath requires a radical engagement with the present. For instance, since ea means both breath and sovereignty, in Hawaii this means not waiting for the United States to leave Hawaii. Scholar and activist Noelani Gudikaupua and others instead view ea as not something to be achieved, but instead practiced at both an individual and collective level. The word and concept also gestures to another value system and temporality, where Skippy Iowane, a longtime activist, describes ea as having the ability to wake up in the morning and decide whether or not you go to work. Indeed, in a moment when the Black Lives Matter movement organizes against police murders, chanting, "I can't breathe," and the deaths caused by COVID-19, a respiratory illness which hit with tremendous speed and lethality due to the politicization of a pandemic by Trump, the United States is itself approaching 1 million deaths by COVID. And the anti-Asian violence committed under the assumption of Asians spreading COVID, the fail-forward pattern of imperial formation that cyclically creates violence and displacement animated by ungrievability, illustrates the failures of US empire, which possesses an intelligent capacity to acquire global hegemony, but lacks any wisdom to sustain life on this planet. We are very fortunate today to have a panel that can help us to think collectively about grief. Today's speakers were curated by Khaty, and we will begin with a reading by Khaty, followed by our speakers, David Ng, who is joining us via Zoom, Jennifer Cho, Mimi Khúc, and Jess X. And so we will end the conversation with audience Q&A. So Khaty Xiong was born to Hmong refugees from Laos. She is the author of the full-length poetry collection Poor Anima and 3 chapbooks, Ode to the Far Shore, Dear Hour, and Elegies. Currently, Xiong is working on her 2nd poetry collection surrounding the sudden loss of her mother, who was a shaman and a medicine woman in her community. The book examines the entanglement of her mother's violent death, the grief that comes with being a child of war refugees, and the impact intergenerational trauma has had on her identity as a Hmong American poet and researcher. She is the Spring 2022 Artist in Residence at the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, and so please join me in welcoming Khaty Xiong.
Let me begin by thanking the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU for having me as the Spring 2022 Artist in Residence, to Dean, Anita, Ruby, Laura, Megan, Grace, and to all the students and volunteers who've made Grief Garden possible. And to those within the community near and far who've been a part of this residency. I never imagined that such a personal event in my life could translate in the need for a memorial, a site of interaction and meditation, a place to name and to give language to what haunts, what hurts, and what empowers us. An opportunity to challenge the clinical and Western cultural concepts of grief and wellness. I am indebted to APA for their faith and support in this project, especially at a time of immeasurable loss, rage, and social injustice. I also want to thank the Poetry Foundation and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center for their collaboration in envisioning the first iteration of this project in 2018, to Fred and to Lawrence, who came to me wanting to give space for the possibilities of grief in all its forms to exist openly and communally. I have spent most of the pandemic in isolation, thinking deeply about community and home, and how so many parts of what makes a community and home have been scattered or thrown into obscurity. I've been searching in the void for a way to piece these parts back together and realize that I can't do it alone. I am so very honored to have this opportunity to present alongside with our guests tonight. Thank you all for being here. The poems I am reading tonight are from my 2nd collection in progress. Spring Thaw. There, crowning by the stream, dead eyes so ruinous the earth loves my mother back. Plainly invading her, gardens ruled by the hot sun, my porous mother cools in the water. Lifting her elbow into view, the cowbird 1/3 my dead sleeping in my eyes. I bleed a little. Pinch the hanged nail. So many good things. My father calling to mountains, my dear, my dear. The grass slicing me up. My mother above the water, a low splintered neck, giving the heart a wash. Nothing is well here. Small branches strangle the trees, and I stand to lose evenly, stewed to watch. I stop seeing the leaves altogether, earthbound ruly. My mother, who cannot live, placing me in the shade. Her legs a little sullied, but now is not the time. The morning parading instincts, strings of aphids clinking from bark to bark, dewy raspberries hanging in shadowed pairs. The sight of those wounds, words in a mouth I won't guess. Peonies gone to rapture. There's a saying before you hit the ground, before bones tear through the perfect organs, before peonies lie deaf, quaking, before they've gone to rapture. Upon first look, the swell of my neck laying passage, the sore gland in homage to the invisible rope made of hands, including the bitten hands of my enemies too sick to pay respect, so I let them live. I pat my thumb and give it a good rub, assemble mother's corpse above the moon and blacken my eye, the way a river hurries over, woman to woman, in honor of the languid year of the dog. Soon, there'll be nothing left to articulate, no parables to unsee the images that'll never go away. My right foot, still right, and my own, not infected nor perforated. In Chinatown, my mother returns to me as a shopkeeper's hands, clutching with season, a pork belly bow, two leathery palms guiding it to a mouth not quite formed, a body still growing on a train leaving east of Kobe. I am in the wrong part of the world, wrong part of home. Time, a thimble, blunting even the water. Khide khimo, khide khimo. My God, what is food? I want to forget the varying prices of death. Forget the muscle that knows hunger better than I know the comforts of my dead, hungry mother. Say goodbye to little gardens rupturing in side alleys, to blooms too heavy they lie on the lips of their potted structures, twisting and searing faith to the sun. Many of these poems are kind of like seasonal chapters in my life, and in exploring how my grief has evolved from 2016 to now, and especially in this pandemic, having lived in isolation, having not been able to see or travel, to see family and to travel very far. Coming to New York is the first time I've left my home, so I'm so deeply moved and thinking about how revisiting these poems, it's a little intimidating even for me, because I'm revisiting memories of where I was, where I don't exactly recognize. Midwest harvest. What have I missed? Strange eyes turning toward the lake, stiff with leeches. Lone dog foaming at the mouth near the tree line. The brilliant loon tangled in spring. Enter chrysanthemums, casting a buttery pasture. Fellow thrush among the needles dissolving. I have gathered in the maze of my palm 4 little acorns, diseased. My missing mother, deceased today of all days. My choices, they say, will last a lifetime. By day, they are true. By night, what else is possible? My hair splitting in the wind. Little nest tattered on a line. Where do I cross? This next poem is about my partner and I driving to an Amish farm to pick up our puppy, Ellie, and she's my first dog. Millersburg, Ohio. The 2-hour drive back was a long cry for us. Hills of corn mapping every whistle and howl. Rain pelting the car. Our puppy, Ellie, wiggling her way through my limbs and calling desperately upon her kin. Her young body leaping through the dark. Startling how we enter sorrow. Our mouths bound to origin, our bloods twisting from ear to tailbone. Our voices translating the clearest notes. The world not yet concerned. I did not concern myself beyond the oaks and stables filled with warm bodies. Could not tell myself that this arrangement was not out of marvelous grief, far from it. But the fields say differently, the mice hiding in them. I sang in company, lifted her up to view what's left of the country, starless, mother possum lined to the road. I have 2 poems left. This one is called What Will Not Keep Us, and it is dedicated to my older sister Lee. Her birthday was yesterday. What will not keep us? To Lee, Gu Tu Nye Lao. My Lee, the evening is lined in root dust. White oleander fortifying a neighbor's yard. Our father's execution rippling in the water. The sun, which will never rise the same way twice. Our flaring livers assume position once more, staging song to bear straight over the ashes of mother's lemongrass. Yato be mahono. Are we shrapnel again in the morning? The water now rusty, the water rode twice, our stomachs silken with milk. Of the gardens we ensnare, we meet ourselves in the harmony of birds wrangling beyond the peaches, catching with due diligence the singular leaf ripped in the scene. In the darkening eaves of the canna lilies, we are the only eyes. May we hope for better where the moon will ask for more. May we know any better. We know already the rice fields won't grow tall enough to hide our bodies when we need to lie down. The fields were not meant for us. Do we understand? The alarm is miles from the flowers. This last poem is about the last time I visited home, which was 2019 in the summer. And I was at my father's farm thinking deeply about the stories he was telling me and how his grief has evolved as well. The pardoning hour. Here at my parents' farm, trumpeting bees scoring in the ears of all flower kind. Chilies and kabocha, 3,400 searing steaks of Indian bittermelon. Gaonu in her hot prison bearing witness. My father emerges from the field, his arms in blooming greens and yellows, a mutable image I never thought possible, my life running in every direction, devoted and never into death. My father calls me over. There by the roadside farm stand, a young coyote repentantly crossing into the golden hills of no return, spilled brain and other wounds bubbling under the aegis of Gaonu. Tuma, my father tells me, the losing cousin of a tiger once revered in the former country. At home, such tales are revealed to me. But there is no story for the desperate cry of a killdeer locked in a small sandstorm, uninvited and combing away at the foot of my father's lesser garden. No hidden meaning when it finally breaks at the towering row of his Chinese waxy corn, where I await my mother's song returning from beyond the Sierra Nevada and into the fettered throats of his guarding cowbirds, whistling in an alarming rise to keep away the flies. In verse, we scold ourselves, dream the good dream, pollutal in the folded tongue, two half shadows thinking through Dahlia, the gift of a curved bone, carving our way back to Zha Pana, Tia Zha Vinai, back even further, the Dinakong, where Tu Cho, lined with cadavers, smells sweet of rice and wild yams, where the buzzards and shadows of B-52s are not allowed to land. I steady myself, though I am not my own talisman, gelid current to napalm eyes. In the sweltering interim, my stepmother pulling her body out of the rusted wheelbarrow, wearing the skin of a great-grandmother, one leg over the rim, the other steeped in noonday ash. My mother's ballad wicking at her brow, tumbling into the nearby bed, prepared just for this moment. Bushels of melon leaves picked for the monthly shipment to China. Hunia Jiaolu, lost again, traversing again into the earth unto a most fluid exile. My stepmother weeping into the mirage of the hissing coyote. Here at the farm where we are absent from dying, I give up and re-enter the valley. What more can I see? Shi Yi, braving the mountains, the dust stirring above my feet, my fist a glowing peach. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaty, for that very powerful and haunting read. So our first speaker in the panel is David Ng. David Ng is Richard L. Fisher Professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is also professor in the program in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Ng is the author of Racial Melancholia, Racial Disassociation, on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans, The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism, and the Racialization of Intimacy, and Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America. Please join me in welcoming David.
It's nice to see everybody, even albeit virtually. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. I just finished teaching and I am teaching again tomorrow morning. So this semester I'm working like an Asian stepchild. I'd like to thank NYU APA Studies, especially Khaty Xiong and the director and office staff, Dean Saranillo, Amita Magnani, Ruby Gomez, Laura Chen Schultz for the invitation to participate in this event and for arranging all the details. Congratulations to APA Studies on your 25th anniversary. We, in fact, just celebrated our own 25th anniversary of Asian American Studies here at Penn. So I like to think of the two programs as psychic wonder twins. And it's a real pleasure to be speaking here today with Jennifer Cho and Mimi Khúc and Jess Snow. So I had a chance to visit the Grief Garden on Monday and to work through, as they say in psychoanalysis, the exhibition's engagement with issues of personal and collective loss. What struck me initially about the installation, which I think you will all see when you go there after this workshop, was the fact that it too was almost lost. So originally, Grief Garden was slated to open in April 2020 as part of the refugee series led by visiting scholar Ocean Vuong. But it was postponed due to the pandemic. In the interim, we have been forced to confront so many more unspeakable losses in the wake of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, Kung Flu, and anti-Asian violence. And we are also now in the midst of confronting another refugee crisis in the Ukraine that occupies our daily headlines. We are right to criticize what Vladimir Putin and Russia are doing in the Ukraine, but that does not obviate the necessity to criticize US-initiated refugee crises in Iraq, the Middle East, and Afghanistan. We must condemn acts of violence and anti-Asian hate, such as the Atlanta spa shootings, At the same time, we must also underscore the fact, as Viet Nguyen has recently observed, that the US state has been the greatest perpetrator of anti-Asian violence in the form of a series of partitions and military interventions in East and Southeast Asia during the Cold War, a cycle of violence connected to Xiong's grief garden. So in my brief comments this evening, I would like to focus on the problem of the relationship between personal and collective loss, that is individual mourning, and how to translate the pain of personal and private loss into a collective and public language. How, as Khaty asks in her exhibition notes, quote, do we meet our grief and face it with confidence? In what ways can we nurture ourselves and each other while living under this current political climate, end quote. In order to explore this relation between the personal and the collective, I want to turn to two historical examples, one drawn from the 1980s in the form of the AIDS quilt, and one from just a year ago, the Atlanta spa shootings. So let me talk about the AIDS quilt very briefly. Today, in the age of same-sex marriage, I think it's hard for those of you in the audience who are young to imagine the silence and suffering that surrounded the loss of a generation of young gay men dying during the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s and the 1990s, before the widespread availability of protease inhibitors in the global north for those with healthcare and insurance. So in the 80s and the 90s, when I came of age, the government, this was under Reagan and across the pond Thatcher, the government and the religious right, in fact, condemned all of these young men, saying that they deserved to die, that they deserved their fate. And many of these young men were closeted and revealed to be gay only in their dying or in their deaths. And biological families barred chosen families, lovers and friends, from funerals, while themselves denying the cause of their deaths. We know from Sophocles' Antigone that the act of mourning is what retroactively confers meaning and value on a life that had been worth living. And if you recall, Antigone's two brothers kill each other in a civil war battling to be the king of Thebes. And the state, in the form of Antigone's uncle, Creon, mandates that one is to be given funeral rites and a proper burial, while the other must remain unburied and unacknowledged. Public acknowledgement of loss and collective rites of mourning thus become the sine qua non of the axiom, as Judith Butler notes in Precarious Life, that a life worth living is a life worth mourning. This is where the AIDS quilt comes in. The brilliance of the AIDS quilt is the way in which, and I don't know if all of you have seen it, but each person would create one patch of the quilt and sew in their loved one's name, the person who was lost. And then all of these patchworks were brought together and sewn together into one giant quilt that was displayed, for instance, on the lawn of the or the gates of the White House, and it traveled around the country. So the brilliance of the AIDS quilt is the contingent gathering together of all these dead young men, the denial of their individual deaths and loss, and therefore the lives that they had lived, and the stitching together of these individual, personal, and private losses into one giant collective tapestry for public display and collective acknowledgement. When I went to visit Grief Garden, I was really struck by the way in which it mimes this logic of the patchwork gathering that the AIDS quilt enacts. How the loss of Xiong's mother is brought together not only with a larger history of war, violence, exile, and displacement embodied in the figure of the refugee, but how this individual loss comes together with multiple other losses of the various viewers who entered this space and who then record their own personal and private losses on paper replicas of the flora found in Franklin Park Conservatory and Botanical Gardens. So after writing down these thoughts, visitors are invited to hang these paper flowers on the 3 trellises of the exhibit. This itself also reminded me of the eloquence by which Maya Lin talks about her ideas in terms of the Vietnam War Memorial, which some of you may have visited, the way in which each viewer needs to look up their loved one's name, find it, find the date that they died, and then walk through the area of the wall to find the date and to find that name. And she describes that temporal process of the viewer doing that and confronting the loss found in the name as really a kind of working through mourning. And so Grief Garden for me becomes this kind of temporal and collective floral quilt of loss. My work with Shinhee Han, she's a New York-based psychotherapist in racial melancholia and racial dissociation. It seeks to delineate the psychic costs of private loss and grief that's turned inward without a public language for acknowledgement. And one of the things that Shinhee and I argue in the book is that when the death drive is turned inward, it becomes singular and directed toward the destruction of the self. It's what she and I describe as racial melancholia. In contrast, when the death drive is directed outward, it often becomes collective and is directed at the other, indeed the destruction of the other. This is a way to think about how the losses associated with 9/11 and the World Trade Centers and the interminable war on terror. That's how melancholia and loss is transformed into collective mania that does not work through loss, but just redoubles the loss and the violence through war and through the repetition of violence. However, when this mania is turned outward into political activism, such as the AIDS quilt, it then orients the world toward justice, what the theorist Douglas Crimpt described in an eponymous essay as mourning and militancy. So I'm going to end my brief remarks tonight by turning to the Atlanta spa shooting, which occurred just a little over a year ago on March 16th, 2021. If you recall, 6 of the 8 victims were Asian American women. I was teaching class, my Intro to Asian American Lit and Culture class, on the day of the anniversary, and I began to discuss with my students the events of a year ago. And I asked them if any could name one single victim of the Atlanta spa shootings. They could not. So I will name them here. The victims at Young's Asian Massage Parlor were Delana Ashley Yawn, who was 33, Paul Andre Michaels, who was 54, Sao Jian Tan, who was 49, and Dao Yu Feng, who was 44. The victims at the Gold Spa were Hyunjung Grant, who was 51 years old, Suncha Kim, who was 69 years old, and Soonchung Park, who was 74 years old. The victim at Aromatherapy Spa was Yong-Ae Yu, who was 63 years old. In our discussions, in my discussions with the class, we began to talk about the Atlanta spa shootings in relation to Black Lives Matter and to the brilliance of the political campaign around say her name, say his name. To say the name George Floyd marks a public acknowledgement of loss and the political necessity to address and to mourn this loss together. We lack this mechanism in the wake of anti-Asian hate, and it is this public garden of grief, among so many others, that we so sorely need to cultivate. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Jennifer Cho. Jennifer is a visiting assistant professor of English at Boston University, where she teaches at the intersections of Asian American literature, film and culture, gender studies, and theories of memory, affect, and trauma. Currently, she is working on a book that rescripts Asian American grief and other negative affects as potent sites of political critique, social redress, and inter-community, cross-racial, and diasporic identification. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
I just wanted to start by thanking the APA Institute for hosting this event, and to Khaty Xiong, Professor Eng, Professor Khúc, and Jess X for your scholarly and creative endeavors in imagining grief beyond its conventional framework. I'm honored to be part of this conversation and to share this space with you today, especially in a time when the precarities of multiple communities here and around the world have become all the more pronounced. The enduring effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, racial capitalism, war and forced migration, the extraction of indigenous lands and peoples, gender, class, and state violence, and climate devastation continue to highlight the inequities in access to care and resources. Too often, these different scenarios play out simultaneously and in concert with each other, so that certain communities' proximities to death or death-like conditions promise and sustain the vitality of the most potent among us. So often in this narrative, the ones who get to live are celebrated, rising triumphant. There's little to grieve when we have moved on, and we hear it quite often in our everyday colloquial language. He's such a drag. Don't be such a Debbie Downer. What a buzzkill. We much prefer the certain comforts of our insulated and positively calibrated worlds than to acknowledge the coeval suffering of others, as well as our role in its continuation. It is, as Elaine Scary writes, to hear that another person has pain is to have doubt. I'd like to think about how these necropolitical conditions, to evoke Akila Membe's term necropolitics, have become so normalized and saturated in our culture that they have dulled our abilities to perceive or register grief when it appears, when the pain of another demands a listener who might hear it. Our quickness to diminish grief may also stem from thinking of it as an individual personal experience that demonstrates a person's extraordinary capacity for emotional resiliency. How does one recuperate from loss quickly and from a place of death move forward with their life? The speed and expediency with which one moves through the grieving process are testaments to her own preternatural disposition and emotional tolerance. Remaining stuck in grief, on the other hand, is seen as unfavorable. It is symptomatic of regressive behavior. It signals a devolution in fully assembled and autonomous personhood that can clearly identify where the past ends and where the present begins. In 2020, prolonged grief disorder, or PGD, was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as DSM-5, alternatively called complicated grief, pathological grief, or traumatic grief. PGD is a recognized diagnosis of extended and unusual bereavement. Unusual in the sense that it diverges from what psychologists identify as normative bereavement. In a typical grieving process, the intensity of grief, as well as its disruptions to everyday routines, ought to be inversely related to the duration of the grieving period. The farther one moves away from the moment of loss, the subject discovers coping mechanisms to resume living. Some generative strategies for processing loss can involve completing restoration-focused tasks. So, for example, joining a grief support group. Positive engagement with loss stressors could also advance recovery. The one in grief might confront objects, that once directly belonged to the deceased, or objects that hold trace residues of the person. It could be a photograph folded into the pages of their favorite book, or an old sweater still redolent with the scent of the deceased. Through repeated exposure to such loss stressors, their ability to incite strong emotional responses recalling grief is diluted with time. However, the pathology of grief sets in and amplifies when the sense of loss is not tempered with time. Rather, the grieving period far exceeds what is designated as normal or healthy. Grief is excessive, not just temporally, but spatially. It confuses the realms of the living and the dead, and it spills over into every facet of life. The diagnostic criteria for PGD follows that experiences of grief must disrupt a person's functioning for more than 12 months. The person is also characterized by a surplus desire for the dead, as well as inhabiting 3 of 8 psychological states, including disbelief, intense emotional pain, meaninglessness, loneliness, avoidance of reminders, numbness, lack of engagement, and identity disruption. If we're to approach PGD as an example of unresolved mourning, whereby the lost object is never recuperated or its replacement is consciously refused in favoring the dead, then the subject cedes to melancholic identification. She clings to an absence that she knows can never be replaced or filled. And perhaps this is what makes PGD so dangerous to the diagnosed patient. Her will to live in the now and the future are constantly compromised by her will to live in the present. It is more familiar there. At this juncture, I don't want to dismiss PGD or empty the diagnosis of its gravity, especially for those whose lives have been severely affected by grief. I also don't want to speak against necessary acts of healing and recovery. I'm grateful for the work of mental health professionals who share their wealth of experience and expertise with those whose livelihood and well-being are enhanced through clinical intervention. But what I'd like to further explore is where we can diversify understandings of healing so they don't simply recuperate or disappear racially marked and othered subjects into dominant modes of representation. When Asian and Asian American bodies have historically been conceived through their pathological dangers and deviancies, especially during the last few years when racialized associations of COVID-19 have made the Asian American community extremely vulnerable to physical and verbal assaults, the PGD diagnosis risks repathologizing the unresolved grief of Asian Americans as somehow incongruent with the health of the nation. Grief is, to return to an earlier reference, a drag on history. It runs counter to narratives of progress and modernity, which promise a grand unfurling of fully realized modern personhood in the future. For somebody who teeters between the thresholds of incompatible temporalities, between the living and the deceased, between the polarities of optimized health, well-being, and sociality, and emotional decay, atrophy, and alienation, cannot be seamlessly absorbed into society. This reading of grief also prioritizes the individual experience and her subsequent negotiation of the incurred loss, alleviating the social order of any blame or accountability for the subject in pain. In reducing grief to a solitary experience, the larger scale structural and systemic violences that create the conditions for loss are forcibly disappeared. And in this disappearance, the language to articulate grief is also minimized. Grief is turned silent. Grief is diffused of its detonative force. It is rendered illegible because so often such grief is peripheral to and in contradistinction to larger projects of US nation building that tell the story of rehabilitating and restoring minoritarian subjects. I'd like to suggest that grief is not only a byproduct of the process of racialization for Asian Americans in the US, but that its effective management from diagnosis as pathology to its resolution through successful assimilation operate as an extension of necropolitical power. While Jose Munoz's exploration of negative affect pertains specifically to the experience of being brown in the US, his determination of national affect as white affect is useful in thinking about how Asian American grief falls outside the normative and visible range of emotive expression. If, as Munoz suggests, whiteness is a cultural logic which can be understood as an affective code that positions itself as the law, then deviations from whiteness can be interpreted as explicit transgressions of the law that are subject to further scrutiny and even punishment. I'm also reminded of Vivian Huang's analysis of Marie Kondo. You may know her of her Netflix series, where she tidies up the homes of Americans. But her unabated joy and cheer, Huang reads as the standard affect for Asian Americans specifically. Huang suggests that positive racial affect, like joy and cheer, build into what she calls a model minority emotionology. This emotionology washes over the gaps between the grievous experiences of being Asian American and then the egalitarian, all-inclusive promises of the US to espouse Asian Americans as their own. If one has achieved model minority status, in effect getting as close to whiteness through compliance to the myth, then one has no reason to feel anything other than joy and cheer. These delightful emotions elide the dissonance between the lived material and psychic realities of Asian Americans and the US narrative that promises the equal and non-discriminatory distribution of freedoms. It distracts from the unresolved racial melancholia that is produced in this space between lived experience and the abstract idealization of the US, a point that Professor Ang, along with Xin Yuan, so effectively invents in their book. In thinking about the particularities of grief in Asian American communities, I recall Cien Ngai's concept of racial animatedness, which suggests that increased racial visibility and difference is produced through exaggerated emotional performances. If, as Ngai suggests, that Asian Americans are rendered visible through a desert of emotions, as a stoic, unfeeling, disinterested group who would rather maintain the white status quo than address their social discontents, then I wonder how de-animating grief among Asian Americans or concealing melancholia through hyper-performative cheer is precisely what racializes them and rouses them to life. Recuperated into the US from perpetual foreigner to an assimilated proxy of whiteness, the Asian American as model minority could only return their gratitude with the corresponding emotional inflections. Grief, rage, vitriol, complaint, and disappointment are less than model responses to a caretaking nation that once pulled Asians and Asian Americans out of the dire primitivism of multiple wars and colonialisms and into more legible forms of social visibility. The prevailing discourses that script US involvement in 20th century wars in Asia, the post-war occupations and rehabilitations of decolonizing countries, and the rehoming of refugees in the US as acts of patriarchal rescue continue to shape Asian American identity domestically. This ideological continuity takes us to the questions Khaty Xiong poses in her artist statement. These are lines that Professor Ang and Dean Saranilio have also evoked in their comments. Khaty writes, particularly in diasporic communities where war and displacement have shaped many generations, concepts of healing may be hard to define, with the search for forgiveness and acceptance even harder paths to traverse. How then do we meet our grief and face it with confidence? In what ways can we nurture ourselves and each other while living under this current political climate? I am struck by Khaty's recognition of the potential to forge new social intimacies by finding each other at the seams of intergenerational and diasporic grief, between physical and imagined borders, between generational divides and languages, and between temporalities. I might add that returning attention to collective grief, searching for and feeling its robust pulse under the flimsy surfaces of liberation narratives that amplify Asian American dependency on US care enacts a form of political critique. To understand and repossess grief as an animate force that invites communal engagement rests the regulation and disappearance of Asian American grief from the state. Khaty imagines in her work, we find each other through the gardens we cultivate to both erratically and radically grieve the histories we share. Through these points of contact and acts of exchange, we might be able to reclaim our autonomy in deciding what exactly we'd like to do with our grief and how long we might dwell in it, even if it is a drag. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mimi Khúc, who is a writer, scholar, teacher of things unwell, and an adjunct lecturer, sometimes in disability studies at Georgetown University. She is the managing editor of the Asian American Literary Review and guest editor of Open in Emergency, a special issue on Asian American mental health, a hybrid book art project that works to decolonize Asian American unwellness. Please join me in welcoming Mimi Khúc.
Content warning: sexual violence, gendered war crimes, parental verbal abuse. A letter by Raven Anand. Dear Amma, I love you, and I want that to preface everything I'm about to tell you. I also hope that this letter never reaches you, for both of our sakes. Every semester I have a low, and I've been getting these lows since the age of 15. I'd hoped that by now I'd know better how to deal with it, how to at least function as a responsible adult. Mental illness is not a term you ever had to familiarize yourself with. You were raised with laziness, undisciplined, ungrateful. You don't understand mental illness, so you tell me that my depression is all in my head and that I should just deal with it. After all, you're able to wake up early, work all day, commute home, make dinner. You remind me not to get fat. You remind me to have friends who won't embarrass you. You remind me to dress not to embarrass you. You remind me to stay out of the sun. You remind me to speak less. On top of tolerating a bothersome child who's out to get you, you keep a clean house and stay involved in your kids' academic lives. I specify academic because you don't know about the rest of me. And I don't think you want to. You don't want me to mention to anyone, especially family, that I take medication for depression or ADHD or trichotillomania. You left Sri Lanka for Canada in the early 90s to escape the civil war that was wreaking havoc upon the Tamils, our people, our family. I was raised with stories of how Tamil women were the favorite targets of the Sri Lankan army's soldiers, often sexually assaulted by multiple soldiers, then their bodies mutilated. I was raised to be grateful that I was not like the poor Tamil women and children back in Sri Lanka. I was raised far from a land I only knew of as savage acts of violence, safe from anything my parents had to fear. Never did I imagine that I would also be sexually assaulted by a group of men. Things like that don't happen here. That's why we left. Rape is a war crime. Where's the war? How ironic that the very thing that my family had fled Sri Lanka for would befall their first daughter not long after she started school at the University of Maryland, the university that they were so proud of her for attending. Once, a letter from the Campus Advocates Respond in Education to Stop Violence unit accidentally got mailed home, and I had to make up a story about how I was harassed, and assault was just a blanket term that harassment fell under. Your immediate reaction was to tell me I was too friendly to strangers, always had been, and why didn't I just ignore the harassers like my friends would have? There was no reason I should have let this happen to me, for hours. You told me to never tell anyone about the assault, especially not family or friends. Fast forward to severe depression and these lows almost every semester. I almost failed out of the university 3 times. Was not prepared to live at home as a constant reminder of failure to you 3 times. Following my assault, I began to binge drink. I binged and purged. I picked away at my skin every day. My friends were disgusted by me. I realized that I was the opposite of what you had hoped for, a failure by many standards. The model minority myth, the concept of filial debt, and the stigma surrounding mental illness create expectations that can be impossible to meet, leaving AAPIs feeling that we have no options to exist outside of those requirements. Hi, my name is Mimi Khúc, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to check in. How are y'all doing? Because we're talking about some heavy shit today. But I'm feeling a lot of presence here, so I appreciate that. And thank you for being willing to experience grief together and being open to that. When Khaty asked me to be on this panel and share work on grief, I was very honored, but also surprised. I don't think of myself as a writer of grief. I live a lot of grief, though, and I witness a lot of grief. I realize that I'm a curator of grief. I create spaces of feeling and vulnerability so that we can feel individually and collectively all the things we are not supposed to. I like to say flippantly that I make cool shit and I make people cry. But what I'm really trying to say is that my mission is to license full feeling, to create in and through pain, because that is the only way to collectively figure out what hurts and how to go on living while it hurts. I am a curator of grief. Today I've brought a selection of grief to share with you, a set of grief that is central to my work, both as impetus and horizon, the grief of students. What I read at the beginning was a letter written by one of my former students at the University of Maryland and published as part of my hybrid book arts project on Asian American mental health, open in emergency. I'm going to share two more pieces of grief in the form of tarot cards. I'm sharing the student card and the pandemic card, two cards that work to capture collective unwellness and grief and putting them in complex context. The student card, which you're seeing on the screen right now, was actually co-created with students all over the country. And I can share more about the process later in the Q&A if folks want, in the interest of time. On the screen, what you're seeing on the left-hand side is an image. That's the front of the card. It's black and white ink brush work with a student pictured at the bottom with many students stacked on top. The students are holding various objects like an abacus, a computer, a graduation cap, books. Many arms are stretched in the air. At the top of the card is the number 29, and the bottom it says the student. And I will read the back of the card now. And I forgot to mention, these are tarot cards that I curated as a part of Open Emergency that we created as a genre and form. The student is the 29th card in the major arcana, sometimes known as the lost card. The student cried the day of graduation. They play one role for the mother, another for schools, another as the daughter, another for workforces, another as the model minority, another for the state, always in the pull of the annihilating void. The student is, at essence, a note-taker. Be grateful, always be okay, chase the promise of this for hours. Never complain, never be sick, keep going. Nothing is ever enough. The work goes impossibly on. Is college life normal stress? What would it mean to leave? Strike that. We're finishing our parents' immigration stories, leaving behind the fact of living. We are not grades, a condition of what can't. Don't feel guilty. Strike that. Drawing the student card in a reading reminds you that student debt extends forward and backward across our collective lifetimes. But ask yourself, what is it you actually owe? Your entire personhood, and then more. We gave you your past, now give us your future. The student urges us to refuse. If schools are a feeder system for churning out good citizens, embrace being a bad citizen. Embrace being a bad subject, a bad student, a bad child, a bad person, a revolutionary. Remember that the Asian American movement was birthed in the fires of student protest, written by students everywhere. The next card I want to share is the pandemic. And this card was actually collectively created just last year in May of 2021 at an event hosted by the University of California Irvine Center for Medical Humanities. And so this was created lifetime, meaning we had discussion groups during the event, and then I and my partner, Lawrence Benbury Davis, sitting right there, live edited based on the discussion that was happening there, and we created this card collectively. And we had this idea, or I had this idea, I curated a series of events at UCI. I had this idea because I felt like we had not had the time or space or ways of mourning 2020 and what we had been going through with the pandemic. And that became very clear in the event, the need for a space to talk about what 2020 has felt like and where we were in 2021. So on the left side of the screen is the front of the card, which is in various shades of blue. Images are swirling down the card, including a person kneeling, wearing a mask with their fist up in the air, a Zoom screen, a window with a silhouette and a hand pressed against it, a hospital bed with an iPad and a mask, essential workers such as medical workers or food workers, a casket, George Floyd, and other people reaching out towards the casket. The number 30 is at the top, and the bottom says the pandemic. Originally, I was going to have us collectively read this. I like to do that where I read a line and people can read lines, but in the interest of amplified sound and accessibility, I'll just read it myself. The pandemic is the 30th card in the major arcana. It has been a long year, like a long decade, one of atrophying time. We miss the way it feels to walk in a city in the current of everyone going somewhere. We don't remember why certain things felt important in the before times. Do remember seeing a classmate in a casket on YouTube live stream. The pandemic unmasks the lie of the word essential. Who provides care? Who deserves care? Death visited disproportionately on the poor, the black, the brown, the lower caste. Returning to normal is an impossibility brimming with longing and terror. In the center of the card is a discarded mask, an iPad by a hospital bed. Say your goodbyes however we can. Toilet paper has become a totem of survival, sweatpants an emblem of refusal, sourdough a gift of renewal. All things will pass like a kidney stone. When will we hold our brother's hand again? Will our kids remember this as the worst time of their lives or as something strange and tender? Will our dogs forgive us when we return to work? Drawing the pandemic card in a reading means a portal is opening. Where it leads is unclear, but remember, people have always slept in doorways, huddled under them during bombings. Who knows if the pandemic will ever end? A collective card. Thank you.
Last but not least, Jess X is a non-binary writer, director, public artist, and poet who creates genre-defying intergenerational stories from a queer Asian immigrant lens. They were the fall 2021 student artists in residence at the APA Institute at NYU, and they are finishing their thesis year in the NYU graduate film program. They bring their background in social movement art, poetry, and trauma-informed healing into their film and immersive work. Please join me in welcoming Jess X.
Hi everyone. It's really good to meet everyone today. I have some poems that I've never read before and a presentation that I wanted to share with you, but I'm really honored to be here, and something that I just wanted to acknowledge is I have never taken an Asian American Studies class ever, or an ethnic studies class, and I am not always a good student, but I am happy to be here and talk about my process. So here are some new poems. At dawn, I asked the ocean, how is it possible to hold so much ultraviolet oxygen and poison all at once? And she told me it was love. And then I asked the earth, what if my nervous system cannot carry the grief of all the Asian femmes, sex workers, and elders that we've lost to violence and deportation? And she said to me, then we can carry it together. And then I asked, what if one day we cave in? She said, then we can transform into something far more infinite. And what would that be? I asked. She said, perhaps the sky. And I looked up and I saw myself. It was raining. My mother and I teach each other how to hold our terror. The day Teresa Tain died, my parents watched her funeral from the television set and had their final fight. The next year, my mom brought me to America. Our applications to projects and food stamps were rejected because we had no green cards, just temporary visas where we learned our Asian bodies carrying Canadian citizenship wasn't American enough. My mom goes to school and learns English. A decade later, she drives me to our new home in the suburbs, and she tells me of her southern China village, a multi-generational family squeezed in a tiny room, how some nights she can still hear the cold wind blowing the newspaper, dividing her bed from grandma's, how some nights she still remembers the Red Guards kidnapping her father. At night, she puts on SPF 30 sunscreen and bleaching cream. She packages outlet mall Coach bags to send to her family back home. We turn on the TV and see the mono-minority land-owning Asian family next to their white neighbors, and I swear this is not the Asian America I want to belong to, but she says I'm lucky to get to question belonging at all. When I'm 17, I prove to her my right to adulthood by performing Good Immigrant so well, the private institution pays for 4 years of my life. When I moved to New York City, my mom calls and says, when I turn on the news, I see people hurt us. The woman in the news could have been you or your friend. I don't bother to tell her that I don't identify as a woman anymore. Instead, I say I love you as if it would be the last time. Over months, our arms adjust to the carrying of this new terror. It is a trembling newborn I do not yet know how to soothe. My mom wants me to move back home, as if home could make it all go away. I tell my mother, us Asians are not alone in this terror, for our Black and Indigenous kin have carried another terror more ancient than ours for 500 years. My mom says, you spend your whole life caring about others before you. I tell her that the stolen land has given us our lives, so we owe it and the Indigenous people who tend to it all of our love and all the land back. But that doesn't mean that I don't love you too. She thinks about this for a second and doesn't speak. In the white noise on the telephone line, we hear our newborn begin to shake. And even with the distance of a whole burning nation and pandemic between us, I know she is holding it with me too. Gazing at the Grand Canyon from the moon. This poem is for my friend Alon Pelez Lopez, who is an Afro-Indigenous poet and organizer who has been one of my best friends throughout this pandemic. On your 30th birthday, you said, take me to the Grand Canyon, and I open the door to the passenger seat and drive you to the largest wound in North America. On the way there, you translate my love poem into Spanish and read it to your mother. When you put down the phone, I tell you I want to be your friend forever, when actually I meant you make me want to be kinder to my mother. We turn on the car radio and hear the government respond to yet another instance of people who look like us attacking each other. I turn off the radio because I know what the institution would call for next. Instead, I wish for them to witness this friendship firsthand, to taste the mole and the Hainanese chicken rice that we cook for each other, to measure the oceans we'd swim and the miles we travel, if only we had wings. If they did, maybe they would think otherwise. Maybe we'd show them how to protect each other so beautifully, we'd no longer need police. You say, I want our mothers to experience a friendship like ours. When we arrive at the canyon, we step out the car and walk to the edge. I follow the river at the bottom with my fingers until I reach your eyes. You close them and let the tears flow. Where does it hurt, I ask you. You are silent for a while until you reply with the whole planet. I feel like we're on the moon and looking back at the Earth's broken heart, and I'm consoling her from a million miles away, saying, I'm so sorry for your pain. I look at you and say, I want to go back to Jiangxi, but I can't leave this country until I get my citizenship. You tell me I want to go back to Oaxaca too. And then you stare at the horizon until we see the border peeking through. If Mexico won the US-Mexico war, we'd already be in Mexico, you tell me. If only we could change history, then I'd rewrite every border with my own hands, I say. But what does moving a border 100 miles north if only it will enclose someone else's homeland? Maybe we should not mess with history, you tell me, because if we did, I would not be here, and neither would you. And then you look me in the eye and say, I want you to exist. And I close my eyes until I feel my own inescapable mortality pulsating like a nightclub inside me. There, I play you a old love song in Mandarin where the singer sings to her homeland as if it were a friend. You said in Spanish there is a song about the same thing. And as you sang, I opened my eyes and saw the steel fence ever so slowly lift itself out from the sand. Thank you. I've been writing a lot of new poems during this time, and when I was asked to speak at this event, I was thinking about what I would want to say and what students at this time, or just like young people at this time, need to hear the most. So I've been also thinking about what my younger self would have wanted to hear, and I wanted to share this poem that I wrote about my own grieving, followed by a short piece of writing that I wrote about my experience working with Chinatown youth from Wild Project, and for this mural that we created last year after the Atlanta spa shooting. So I hope these offerings are able to help us transmute the grief through our bodies and think about the millions of ways that we can respond to grief and build the futures that we dream. How I wake up and start again. I show up on television to speak of the healing power of public art, even though I am broken. At a visual in Washington Square Park, the organizers placed incense, fruit, and a homemade dinner on 3 massage beds as a cellist plays a melody to hundreds of us in prayer, and I know that the trees are singing too. On my way home at night, I cover my face with a mask and practice my peripheral vision and look both ways before crossing. I wonder what the mothers dreamt of the morning they woke before their last night at the spa. Were they preparing to celebrate the birthdays of their children? Another perfect circle around the sun, and this year, the first time without mothers. They never consented to the immortalizing of their lives on the internet to be shared over and over. If I was a dragon, I wouldn't want to be remembered for how I was slain, but rather the ways I soared and who I chose to fly with. When the sun goes down, I prepare to repeat this all again. So at night, I phone my friends, one after the other. Alon tells me of a canoe where we are laying in the middle of a calm lake. With the blink of our eye, we teleport all our favorite foods from Jiangxi and Oaxaca onto our laps. Frizzly tells me of a future where we are traveling the world making movies without thinking of the limits of budgets and green cards. May lies under a weighted blanket and tells me about rest. Homemade taro rice balls after a weekend afternoon nap, the smile that greets her lips as she peeks out the window and sees our mural of her hand holding poles. Adriel turns on a time machine and plays me home videos of our community's future children. After the decades that their ancestors spent learning how to keep each other safe without the state, they spend their days dreaming about other things, like superpowers, gardens, and outer space. I listen to these stories, and suddenly the spirals subside, and for the first time this week, I can finally sleep. I share with you these poems to give you a window into the struggles of my grieving process. I want to remind you that this pain can cut you open, but it can also be the greatest teacher. As much as you feel isolated, we are not going through this alone. It is okay to go offline. We are not meant to be constantly exposed to the news on a minute-by-minute basis. We are worth more than what capitalism demands of our productivity. My younger self wishes that they knew it isn't the responsibility of one person to end violence and solve our collective grief, because ending systemic violence of the US settler colonial state requires slow, long-term, multi-generational solutions that I believe begin with trust. It is true that we cannot erase the wounds of history. We cannot unsee the poems of heartbreak carved onto the walls of Angel Island's detention centers during Chinese exclusion. We cannot bring back the mothers in Atlanta, but we can choose to come together as friends, collaborators, and allies to dream and organize together into more loving and sustainable futures. Adrienne Marie Brown reminds us that movements move at the speed of friendships, and friendships move at the speed of trust. Walida Imarasha reminds us that our ancestors dreamed of us and bent realities to create us. In the times that I am sad and burned out, and my friends are unable to pick up the phone, I look into history and imagine the 1800s and all the unrecorded moments where Chinese railroad workers and indentured Native servants and freed Black slaves might have practiced mutual aid with each other. I picture the revolutionary friendship between Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama and what late night phone calls they'd have with each other when they were immobilized by grief. And I remember in the 1980s, Black Panthers in Oakland visited Asian women in San Francisco's Chinatown, and they worked to create a new coalition to protect Chinatown. I know the trust and strong friendships that our ancestors put into practice open portals to the future, the world that we live in today. My friend Alan Pelez Lopez reminds us that at its best, friendship is abolitionist because it is a form of care and accountability that doesn't rely on the state's ideas of who belongs to empire. My current friendships have taught me how to dream expansively and rest courageously and do things I never in 1,000 years could do alone. Last summer, 2 months after the Atlanta spa shootings, I came together with a group of femme Asian artists, Chinatown youth, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous friends to paint a 3-story mural that declared in the future our Asian community is safe. We looked each other in the eyes, acknowledged our rage, and together moved the grief from our hearts into our feet, into the Chinatown concrete, and watched it transform into a seed that bloomed into the body of a youth holding a red envelope to illuminate 2 elders locked in monumental embrace as the indigenous plants of Lenape-Hoking showed us the way back toward the sun. This future was not a dream. It was a declaration chanted into reality by community. It is a future where our Asian community unlearns all the harm of the US empire has taught us and actively builds kinship with indigenous folks. And we work hand in hand with Black communities to learn how to defend and protect each other without police. In the future, we learn how to resolve conflict beautifully. In the future, we betray this empire and build a new world in its place, grounded in solidarity. In the future, solidarity is not a social media performance, but rather a lifelong commitment to love. And love isn't something that we have to wait generations for, but rather a seed that we can begin to water now. We need artists and writers to visualize the blooming of the seed into the biodiverse forest that it will one day become. We need musicians to help us feel the softness of that future in our bodies when the world leaves us numb. We need doctors and healers to remind us of our body's inherent resilience. And we need organizers to remind us how to arrive at the future when the rest of us forget. We need you in that future. The murals we make and the stories we tell and the friendships we build are portals. What friendships will you tend to today? What portals will you open together? And what kind of futures may we collectively build? Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here, and to our guests who have presented tonight. I have so many questions, and I hope to ask them, but I hope to ask them all. I also would encourage for us to ask each other questions too. This is meant to be more of a conversation, and we will also take questions from the audience, time permitting. But my first question, actually, so the questions that I'll be asking, anyone can really jump in and answer, but I had designed these questions with the particular people in mind speaking tonight. So am I still loud enough? Okay, wonderful. So my first question is actually to David, who was here as well. David, I've been thinking very much about this notion of a quote-unquote a morning without end that you and Dr. Shin-Hee Han mention in the book Racial Melancholia and Racial Dissociation. And this notion of a morning without end bleeding into what you both have labeled as a national haunting. And this national haunting as a result of enforced psychic amnesia, that all these histories of exclusion towards Asian bodies. I suppose the question, and this is geared towards the whole panel, is as Asian American generations deepen in this country, as we take root, how do we effectively remember our histories without harming ourselves? So that is my question.
That's a very important question. I mean, you're asking the $100,000 question. And I think that on the most basic level, in terms of what Dean was talking about, it's the 25th anniversary of Asian American Studies at NYU. It's the 25th anniversary of Asian American Studies at Penn. That would seem to be a really monumental thing, and it is. But it doesn't actually speak to the struggles that both students and faculty have put into Asian American Studies, because it's precisely in these programs that we learn about our histories. And I will give you an example at Penn, which the entering class this year is 1/3 Asian and Asian American. So we have over 3,000 undergraduate students who are Asian and Asian American. Up until this year, we've had only 3 tenure track faculty teaching in the field. And so if, I'm not a math major, but if you do that math, that's 1 faculty per 1,000 students. And in no liberal democracy could you have that imbalance of representation, but for Asian American students, that imbalance of representation is an everyday affair at many, many universities. So Penn is not unusual that way. It's actually quite indicative of the norm at all of these schools. So simply on the question of, how do we remember our history, it needs to be taught. And in order for it to be taught, there has to be an institutional space. So that's really, in my sense, a question of just the material conditions by which Asian American history can be produced and reproduced. The question of how to teach that history without harming ourselves is really about the nature of working through trauma. And as I was saying, or trying to say earlier, the issue of curing the lack of acknowledgement of trauma and loss, it can result in 2 things. It can result either in the reversal of that melancholy, not toward the self, but toward the other, in terms of war and violence. So ironically, that just redoubles the hurt and harm. And that's, I think, one way of repurposing the question that you just asked. But another way of collectivizing that loss and turning it from the inside to the outside is to channel that energy into a working through of loss and a working through of melancholy. And that I see as political activism. And so it is the political activism that gathers that energy toward a social goal. And so here you actually have to think not just about the psychic response to how to remember differently, to remember loss, to acknowledge loss without harming oneself. That's not just a psychic question. For me, that's actually a social question. So the remembering the loss and not going through the harm again actually is about creating a world that is different. And as long as we live in the world that we continue to live in today, it will be very hard to work through that loss without the harm. But when the harm disappears, it will precisely be because we have a different world.
Thank you so much. That's an incredible answer. But I also am curious if anyone else as well wanted to add their thoughts to what's been mentioned. Yes, Mimi.
Yeah, I would. This is Mimi speaking. I think this event actually is an example, right, of sitting with past harm in a way that, at least for me, feels not harmful, even as it's painful. Like, I want to distinguish between painfulness and harmfulness, because, you know, as the Princess Bride taught us, life is pain, right? Because a concept that I've been working through in my work is how we are all differentially unwell. We are all unwell. We are all dealing with pain and suffering and unwellness in different ways at different times. And how do we manage that? How do we navigate that? It is actually to acknowledge it and sit in it, right? And today I think we're doing some of that work, and it's hard work. It's hard fucking work to sit with how much things hurt and to share it with other people, but it seems very necessary in order to, some of David's language, move through it together, right? And to move through it in a way that doesn't necessarily get rid of it either, but to really figure out what it means to live while in pain.
Yeah, and I just add on to these amazing comments and thinking about the harm residing in not having the channels to identify violence against Asian communities as hurtful or as invasive, as careless. And so I think we need to create space to call harm when we see it happening, and just to, and this event, of course, is enacting that practice, I think, right? To name the grief, to see it, to work and move through it. And I love just the language you used about the biodiversity of this kind of world building that you envision as part of our future. And I think to claim the grief in a way goes against those model minority conceptions of us as unfeeling, or as impervious to pain. So we'll just kind of leave it there.
Yeah, thank you.
I think for me, something that comes into mind is as like Asian folks and folks who have survived multiple generations of trauma, and as folks who are hurting, I think when we do come together and we do the work of creating like community projects and like creating new worlds, because nobody has fully truly healed from like all the harm that has happened historically, and because we are dealing with ongoing violence on a daily basis, I don't think it's fully possible to like never harm like other people or even ourselves in the even in the process of doing this work. I think it's possible to reduce the harm and to find and to look toward transformative justice and find ways of transforming harm and conflict resolution that is not more harmful. And I feel like I dream of a future where we are all taught these tools, and so we don't rely on like the systems that we've been taught, like disposability or like policing and prisons, and keep enacting that on our intimate relationships and friendships. And we have the language to acknowledge that sometimes our communities do fail each other, and sometimes we do harm each other, but that doesn't have to define us, and we can still learn how to transcend that and still build these futures in the face of that.
Just thinking about what you've recently spoken about, Jess, and also the work that you create and you build these portals that where imagination inside them houses life and resilience, and that's something I've been thinking deeply about as well, beyond just literature in terms of visual and filmmaking, the work that you have created. My question, and because you have mentioned this notion of tools, that we already possess these tools in our bodies ancestrally and presently, I wonder for those of us who are in the audience, but also everywhere else as well, where do we begin, and what is the first gesture towards unlocking these safe portals and these safe spaces? What does that look like, beginning in our lives? What does that translate for anyone really, and for you, for Mimi, for Jennifer? What does creating that space, how do we get there? Where do we begin?
I think the first gesture is vulnerability. I think that the only way to create safety is to be vulnerable, to model safety, right? But then to ask for it. And so that requires a kind of trust and commitment to each other in collective spaces and community, right? And so I actually think of vulnerability as a tool, not simply like a state of being, but it's a tool that I harness in my work in terms of like sharing my own vulnerability, but trying to create spaces of vulnerability and safety for others so that we can do collective work. That sometimes happens in the writing, sometimes it is the opening of the laptop, sometimes it's in activated spaces, sometimes it's in online interactions, but I think the through line for me I'm thinking of as you're asking this question is vulnerability and it being very intentional vulnerability and trying to create that.
Yeah, and I think just speaking off of vulnerability, like I feel like after I witnessed me be vulnerable, I felt like I could be vulnerable too. So I kind of see one's vulnerability as a way to open up portals of vulnerability collectively, and being able to feel that today felt really powerful to me. And I think a quote that comes into mind is one time I was at this transformative justice conference, and Mia Mingus, who is a disabled Korean adoptee organizer, said something along the lines of how can we end violence on a global level if we can't even solve the small instances of harm that happen between two people. And I think about how vulnerability is like a requirement in terms of conflict resolution, when harm is like inevitable, and sometimes that like harm is sometimes directed toward ourselves, and we have to be able to be vulnerable to ourselves, and in the micro moments that we have every single day, whether it's between friends or like our parents or with like the earth itself, and sharing those micro moments. Each of those micro moments is a portal toward the future that we want to live in, and how we show up in those micro moments.
And to hinge on this, this metaphor of portals, I think part of that work involves understanding how we might block access to those portals for certain communities too, I think. So I think, yes, our grief as a community, as Asian Americans, is palpable, it's real, it's sincere. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that anti-Blackness, homophobia, classism, colorism, those stances can happen within Asian American communities themselves. So maybe part of that work of being vulnerable is understanding how we are complicit in closing access to those portals too, perhaps.
I'm overwhelmed as well because I feel like I have spent my entire life trying to make sense of my relationship to my parents who are first generation. And as second generation, there really is no guidebook in how to make that work and how to navigate that life. And especially to think of this notion of gratefulness, that's also something I struggle. Folks will say, oh, you know, your family is here, they came as refugees, aren't you grateful that this is a possibility? And it is a very difficult thing to stomach because I think to myself, well, had it not been for my parents who wanted so badly to live and to make it here and to have arrived, I would not have lived, but it is also because of US imperialism that has sent my family tumbling this way and displaced against their will. And trying to access the vulnerability, not just privately, but with others, and being brave to share that, and to ask that you simply need help. That's something I still struggle with doing with confidence. So I'm very touched to hear your responses, vague or abstract or not. I think it has to be vague and it has to be abstract because we're still living in it. And we're not quite there in the future yet. The future is that Jess dreams of, that we dream of, that we all dream of.
Can I just say, fuck gratefulness? I talk about the concept of compulsory gratitude, right? The being compelled to be grateful, and I think the examples you gave are really actually maybe two distinct forms that I thought about and I think are very powerful and probably resonate with a lot of folks here, right? The gratitude to your parents for their sacrifices. And then supposed gratitude to the nation that supposedly welcomes us, and I think that's particularly high stakes for refugees, right? I also come from a refugee family, and so the narrative of rescue and then the conditional belonging that we receive here in the US requires of us a kind of gratitude and performance of respectability and good citizenship, right? That actually, if I recommend people read Erin Ning's work, it's NINH, on the immigrant family and the connections actually between those two forms of gratitude that happens in the immigrant family and then in the nation, and how destructive that actually is for the second generation in particular. So thank you for bringing those up.
I think of in Minor Feelings when Khaty Xiong declares, I'm not indebted, I'm not grateful. I mean, this is a really unfaithful paraphrase, but it kind of signals that protest of the narrative or expectation of gratitude.
Yeah, I wonder how, as we spend the rest of the night, and we'll make sure to take some questions as well that students may have and the folks in the audience may have. One last question to all of you is, and especially Jennifer, as I think about your concentration in focusing on grief and shame in Asian American texts, and how Asian Americans grapple with vulnerability and the trust to give in to that. We often turn to art and literature as a place and as a power to help memorialize our wounds and those sites of trauma. So, and when we write and when we create, we defy these pre-written narratives about us, who we are, no matter the generation we're in. So my question to everyone tonight is, whose work do you turn to or return to as a source of nurture
I will confess I'm a terrible reader. I actually don't like reading, even as I am a scholar of literature and other kinds of forms of writing. So I'm going to dodge this question by saying that the narratives that I find nurture in, even as they're actually incredibly painful to engage as well, is actually of students. I think my students, the students I've encountered, the students I've met across the country who I've spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot of students and tried to listen to them, they're a continual reminder to me about the stakes of the work, like why it matters, whose lives are at stake, but also the direction the work has to take. I think students are keyed into the structures that fuck up their lives in more ways, I think, than some of older folks, and I include myself in that, unfortunately. And so I feel like I get life from listening to students because I think they know what's up and are really earnestly trying to do the work of creating this better world that Jess is imagining. And so, yeah, I like to dream with them.
I guess I think about like how I think about the earth. I think the earth gives me nurture. I read somewhere that there's over 100,000 species of flowering plants that know how to like coexist beautifully, and then I think about how us humans, we haven't even figured out how to coexist, and I think the earth can teach us how to nurture ourselves and each other, but also I think about how being an Asian immigrant and being a settler on stolen indigenous land, what that means for our relationship with the earth, and perhaps to be able to cultivate a nurturing relationship with the earth at all, we need to learn how to support indigenous land back movements, and also my friend Treya Lam, who is in the audience, is a musician, and I feel like their music helps me connect with the earth and also the lands that my family have left behind in our immigration journey. So yeah.
I mean, most recently, and it's stepping a little outside of Asian American literature, but I just picked up the 40th anniversary edition of This Bridge Called My Back, and Jerry Moraga offers a new preface to that anthology, and I just love it. You have to read it because she takes a strong stance against returning to any sense of normalcy pre-COVID-19, because it would be a return to a continuation of all of these inequities that we've been all talking about today. So there's a lot of kind of radical imagination of alternative futures, I think, in that preface that both your students and your work, Jess, and then of course your poetry as well, sort of imagine. So that would be my answer there.
Thank you. David, do you have anything you want to say?
I want to say that it's the hardest question to ask a lit professor what is his or her their favorite book. So what you turn to, because I think for me, this is, I guess, going to be a little abstract, but trying to tie together our discussion, I would say that what binds all of us together in terms of our work, whether as filmmakers or as poets or as literary studies faculty, psychoanalytic critics, is that we're all trying to find a form to tell the story differently. And at the end of the day, healing from trauma and from harm and from injury is nothing more and nothing less than telling the story to yourself differently. And because as long as we are alive, our lives are historically and contingently bound by the events around us, what kind of narratives we need in order to tell the story differently change from time to time, or from minute really to minute. And so what I find extraordinary about art and any kind of form of art is the fact that it can tell the story differently, and it can rearrange your desires, not through the barrel of a gun, but merely through images and words, right? So this is a concept that the post-colonial critic Gayatri Spivak has written about in many different iterations, but that literature is the uncoercive rearrangement of your desires. And in rearranging those desires, you often can create a different narrative that lets you heal. So the art forms that I'm really attracted to, especially in times of in difficult times, are films and books and poems and stories about loss and how people work through loss. And I think about something like the Japanese film Afterlife, which if you haven't seen, you should all go see, or you maybe should, or a more contemporary iteration of that is Drive My Car. And the way in which in Afterlife, all these people end up, in this warehouse, and they find out that they're dead, and that the people there are social workers for the dead, and they say to them, you're all here because you're dead. We're sorry for your loss. And what you need to do is choose one memory to bring with you into the afterlife. And so the entire film is about each person struggling with trying to preserve what is the one memory that they want to preserve for eternity. And what you come to realize is that the social workers who process the dead are there because they couldn't choose. They couldn't choose that one memory. And, so I find solace in seeing people work through their own loss. And there's so many, there are dozens of, I think, films and books, from Just Your Life to Afterlife, to the work, the political work on AIDS and mourning that I talked about. So it doesn't necessarily come in one particular form, but it's that those forms allow a way to look at your situation differently.
Thank you so much. And I know we've got 2 minutes here. So I would love to open it up to the audience for those who may have questions for all of us or one of us or whomever. And if possible, I just realized there are no mics in the audience too. Oh, okay, never mind, someone's on it. Perfect.
Hi, so I have a question that could really be answered by any of the panelists, but in thinking about this idea of gratefulness that you were discussing before, I think of the idea of elite capture, or maybe like the entrance of certain individuals who identify with minority groups into rooms of power. And essentially as storytellers, that makes you all powerful as writers, as artists. And so while the entrance of minorities into these rooms of power are victories, it's impossible to expect those individuals to represent the diverse experiences of the people they identify with. So I guess my question is, how have you grappled with that internal dilemma? And, how can individuals tell stories in a way that represents their community without, minimizing the Asian American identity to just a sole representative?
I'll say something very quickly, which is that Asian American identity is not a static thing. It's continually changing. And this is a concept that comes from my colleague, Baki Mani. We have to stop imagining that representation and belonging are the same thing. So that in the representations that we create, we don't necessarily have to assume or presume that those representations automatically will translate into a collective belonging. I also think that this is a concept that I derive from Angela Davis, where she says, the most important thing is not to let our identity drive our politics, but to let our politics drive our identity. And so if we have a kind of common goal around our politics, then what Asian American identity may come to be and who it might come to encompass is actually a question, not an answer.
So I was just thinking about different cultures and how they might express grief, and I was talking to a friend of mine who identifies as a death doula and is Laotian, and she was saying how in her culture she doesn't have a word for grief. So I was just curious for y'all to talk a little bit more about how you see culture in your own culture. How is grief associated with in your life? And then what is the role of Asian American communities to kind of reclaim those practices in a new form or a new way to kind of talk about grief?
It's occurred to me actually that even in the Hmong language, and maybe somebody else of the culture and the language might even know the term, but I feel to my knowledge there is also no direct translation for the word grief. Because grief itself is it is a way of life. And when I think about my parents and how they've tried to grapple with and hold their own sorrows, but fail in the aspect of not being able to know what kind of language could capture that, they have also turned to other art forms like song poetry and embroidery. And the embroidery aspect was meant to preserve not just the stories, but the hurt inside them as well. So I'm trying to think here to myself, and now I feel like I need to consult with somebody, like a relative. Is there a direct translation for it? But it's almost unusual for there to be any direct translations, I feel, in most Asian languages, because they're so colorful and flowery, and they describe more the experience than the actual labeling of the term itself that we understand today as grief. But as I sit here and think, I would love for someone else to chime in as well.
Thank you for that question. So I'm Vietnamese American, and I want to think about Vietnamese American grief in historical context, because in my family, there is no memory before war. Right? And so grief in my family has been structured completely by experiences of multiple wars and then displacement and exile, and then return, and then all kinds of weird, fucked up relationships with the Vietnam now, right? So grief is structured by all of those things, and so I'm wary of thinking about a kind of like originary or essentialist idea of what grief practices. I guess I want to use the word practice, maybe. Practices may have looked like in Vietnam, because they've always had the backdrop and the forces of war to shape those practices, and they have changed over time drastically. And I think maybe one form of grief that I'm seeing in Vietnamese American community that I think about actually goes back to maybe that question about gratitude earlier, and representation a little bit. I actually think that the compulsory gratitude in Vietnamese refugee families is actually one expression of grief, and trying to figure out how to make sense of loss and make sense of displacement and trauma by re-narrating themselves into the American dream, right? And raising model minorities. And so I want to link those kinds of practices, which we don't normally think about as grief practices, to a backdrop of grief.
Yeah, I echo sort of the risk of essentializing grief, where I guess it roots in the culture. But I think similarly in Korea, there's a sort of related term to grief, han, which does touch on those histories of colonialism, Japanese-American war, and it's a sense of, I guess, intergenerational transmitted grief across continents and has, I think, a diasporic function as well. But again, I think we need to kind of create some fluidity around how we imagine it, so we don't simply say this is a feature of an entire people or culture.
Thank you all so much.
I'll be thinking about this for a long time. I'm so grateful that it's being recorded. I feel like I want to watch it again, and didn't realize how much grief I was personally carrying, needed to process, and hearing you all put it into words was very, I'm just so grateful. Just a few quick announcements. So Khaty's books are available for purchase and signing in the lounge outside of this lecture hall. The Grief Garden is at 8 Washington Mews, which is very short walk from here. And so you can please come and you'll be available to attend the Grief Garden until 7:30. Please just show your programs from this event and your green passes for entry. There's a map on the program. And also, we encourage folks to arrange for class and group visits by emailing us, apa.rsvp@nyu.edu. Thank you again so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to Khaty for moderating and curating, but also thank you so much for your residency. It was such a beautiful residency, and we were so good today. Thank you to all for coming and for the great questions.